Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. This lecture is on ethical communication. Ethics is so important. Ethics in general is important to strive toward, especially when it comes to communicating with others. So some of the learning objectives, we have about 30 slides in this chapter. So recognize a situation where there's an ethical problem. Know questions in order to ask and act in an ethical manner. Consider moral obligations for both parties. And then apply ethical principles appropriately. Things that go into it are listed here as well. So when we talk about ethics, it's the study of principles governing proper conduct and action. Sometimes there's business tension, right? You hear about this a lot, but between profits and ensuring the well-being of others, make sure at times you're doing what's best, not just for the company, but for yourself and for others. From the perspective of professional functions, conflict within roles sometimes happens. So steps for making ethical sound decisions, you want to always assess the situation. Ask the questions. So on page 351, there's some information about writing ethically. I think this is a kind of cool piece. And on 350, it's about assessing the situation like we talked about. Ask ethical questions, consider your moral obligations, and apply the principles that we're going to learn in this chapter today. So, when you assess a situation, what does that consist of? It really consists of a variety of different things. I find at times really challenging is recognizing conflicting roles. So one person might have a role that's different than the other, and understanding what someone else's need is in comparison to what yours is when the ethical conflicts arise. It might not be you as well. It could be the other party having a challenge with someone else, and you're a third party to this situation. So understanding of course, like it mentions here, the short and long-term goals is an important aspect of making sure you find common ground. Because common ground is an important factor when it comes to communicating with others. So to ask ethical questions on 352, kind of the table that I like to look at. It's really interesting. I think it's very helpful. Keep it in front of you. I actually have this printed out in my office, so it helps me follow certain guidelines in order to be effective. From the perspective of when I read this chapter, I'd not seen something similar to this before. So one of the things you want to ask yourself is my message false, descriptive, or misleading? Am I being accurate in what I'm saying? Does it exploit the vulnerabilities of the target audience? You hear this a lot, especially in debate. Making sure you come to a conclusion that doesn't exploit other people's challenges from an ethical standpoint. Is it discriminatory? Definitely never do that. Does it promote stereotypes? We don't want to do that. That is discrimination. And that's not something that we, of course, condone or anyone with good conscience would. Does it infringe on someone else's right to privacy and confidentiality? That's an important thing. So does it cause harm to others? Have I committed theft by stealing proprietary information that might damage someone else's credit? That's plagiarizing, right? Plagiarizing from the perspective of communicating, right? When I'm writing. So you hear about plagiarism mostly when you're writing, but you can steal other people's ideas as well, and that does make a harmful situation for someone else, the person who came up with it originally. So that's a negative form of communication. Does my message erode social values? Does it ruin society? And does it my message cause a conflict of interest? This is also from the perspective of myself. Do I hurt myself when ethically communicating in a negative way? Well, it would be unethical, right? So considering your moral obligation to both parties, and let's look at this from the chapter's perspective, that you want to remember are yourself, your family, your friends, your clients, your colleagues, your firm, the people you represent, the community, the firm meaning people you work for, and the environment. Moral problems arise when moral obligations conflict with one another. So apply the ethical principles that we're going to talk about here. The appeal to rights. So ethical questions that can be resolved by appealing to the notion of human rights. So human rights are, of course, intuitive. You should know what those are, but making sure you appeal to what's best for others. Appealing to utility, ethical actions that create the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. That common ground, right? How do we meet and find common ground in order to be successful across the board? How about virtue? Look at the nature of the individuals and people and recommend positive character traits that might help take out that negative character trait that we talked about. So different laws and regulations, of course, govern intercultural ethics, and that's something that you're going to see in the chapter on page 354. It's got a great quote, I think, two of them. One by Jesus: "Do unto others as you would have done unto yourself," and then "Do not do unto others as you would not have done to yourself." So kind of the same quote, but coming from two different people, being the one who quoted the latter, or who said the latter. So sex discrimination happens far too often. It's something that is unacceptable. When we treat one group differently than the other, that's a part of intercultural ethics. Make sure that you understand that and you don't move in that direction from an ethical standpoint. Social values appear the values of a particular society by tailoring publications to fit its mores. That is explained also here on 355, social values, making sure you value others in your communication. So let's move on to slide 11. The power of shared values are really important. Many companies create code of ethics. My company has a code of ethics. Doing the right thing for others at the right time is always essential. And of course, you're going to say code of ethics are something that's seen at schools. It's something that's seen in everyday life. So this is the expectation. When you're here, you function in this capacity, and we have to follow those in order to be successful from the perspective of treating others in a way they deserve to be treated. All right. Moving on to the next 10.2, and we're going to talk a little bit about this 8 learning objectives here. One thing that I want to point out, really, really important, number 3, using label and certification correctly, and we'll talk about that here in a second. Quality information. What kind of information are you delivering? Figure 10.3 on page 358. Is it useful? Is it objective? And is it secure? The 3 things that you want to look at from the perspective of quality information. Useful doesn't waste information. Objective is being clear, accurate, and unbiased. Secure is not corrupted or falsified, right? Correct information. And quality information is thus information that is useful, objective, and secure. The 3 of those put together. False information is something that you hear a lot. A lot of people might do this unintentionally out of ignorance, but it includes falsified documents, fractured data, things like that. Omission is withholding information. You hear about this a lot in the court setting. Omission, making sure you're not withholding information on purpose. And if you do, hopefully it's not from a perspective of ignorance. Misleading information, false implication, false consensus, exaggeration. This happens probably most of the time. People exaggerate, and that leads to misleading or biased information. Biased information, just as we mentioned, often occurs as a result of conflict of interest. Maybe you have a conflict of interest from the perspective of you're on the lookout for helping someone get the promotion they want, so you're misleading information and exaggerating their skill set based on what they actually can or cannot do. So maybe it's a friend. Maybe you want your friend to get this job, and you give exaggerated information to the recruiter, who then eventually hires this person based on the data that you gave. That would be biased information, correct? And definitely something that you would not want to do. Usually it's something that you want to be careful with. I think table 10.2 has some great information. Not going to spend a lot of time there, but feel free to look at it, and it tells you where we talk about that in sections of the book. All right, moving on to labeling and certification. Greenwashing is when companies mislead the public into viewing them or their products as eco-friendly. You hear about this a lot because we're moving to an eco-friendly environment. Climate change is a big thing, making sure you're communicating that your company is doing things that will help the environment. If it's not actually, it's called greenwashing, and that's something that's communicated in, of course, a negative way. But from the perspective of those doing the communicating, it's kind of biased, and it also is from the perspective of incorrect labeling. All right, moving on to number 17. Intellectual happens a lot, right? When you steal someone's idea, come up with it yourself, maybe identify to the public that it was your idea when it was someone else's. That would be intellectual property theft. I hear about this and think about the computer industry when a lot of these things happened, but it still happens, of course, today, and you see it quite often in the news. Academic plagiarism, right? We're going to have a paper that's due in this class, making sure you're not plagiarizing. So if you read something and you didn't come up with the idea yourself, making sure you give someone else the benefit of that in your references, right? So reference and citing the source is important. And APA citations is what we're going to do in this class, APA references. So making sure you're correct. And we've talked about plagiarism already, so I'm not going to hone in on this a lot, but that's an important part of doing what's best from communication of an ethical standpoint. And I'm not going to go into this because I know you guys know a lot about it. It's on page 363, but from that perspective, making sure you give people the credit when especially they've done the work prior to you. Okay, trademarks, you see this, registered trademark, the R symbol, something that someone's already thought of, so they patent it per se, and I think it's not really called a patent, but they trademark the symbol. You can see this Coca-Cola, right, has a trademark symbol. All these other companies oftentimes have trademark symbols, so someone doesn't repeat or have a product that's similar with a similar type of label that someone can confuse for their original stuff. And sometimes there's lawsuits that happen. Probably I've heard of this before, but I think of the soda industry more than anything else, but there's lots of examples. All right, warranty. So it's a promise by a firm to stand behind its product when a customer purchases it. So car warranty would be a good example of that. That's ethical from a perspective of, hey, if you buy our vehicle, we're going to be able to give you a warranty and have coverage if there's an issue, labor, parts, and there's different types of warranties. Express warranties are statements about a firm's commitment to remedy defects on an issue, and an implied warranty is unspoken, unwritten promises created by law to assure that product will function as expected. Moving on to the next slide. Liability. State of being liable or responsible when consequence of a user being harmed or inadequate warnings or instructions occur. Liability happens from the perspective of maybe you bought a car and it didn't perform the way it's supposed to, so the company would be liable from that perspective. There's lemon laws and things that go into effect, but this is a really interesting part of ethical communication. Maybe when you bought the car, you were communicated, maybe unwritten, that certain things wouldn't happen or function in a certain way. That's part of ethical communication. You might think, hey, why is this in the communication chapter? Well, because ethical communication warranties liabilities. A lot of times that's written, but often it's unspoken. And you're communicating with someone that's purchasing the vehicle, as an example, and that's an important thing to note. So the book in this class wants you to be aware of how that works. Confidentiality, right? Privacy, HIPAA. We talked about HIPAA, HIPAA. Making sure that you're talking and you're confidential and you're private about certain things that are not supposed to be disclosed. This is better, of course, when we're talking about healthcare. It's better for patient care. It protects the patient's rights. And we've not had this in place for a long time. Privacy has always been a thing, but HIPAA in healthcare has not always been as stringent as it is today, but it's very important because we want to take care of others and they have rights, and we should make sure we recognize those. Moving on, disguising the type of document, making sure you're camouflaging marketing materials as educational publications, and distributing sales letters as objective informational newsletters. Visual ethics, making sure you're not having distorted information. So misguiding people. It's unethical to have manipulated data, right? That's just an example of that. You want to not, sometimes you have to disguise a document because you don't want to know, like you don't want to show where it came from. Maybe, I'll give you an example. In healthcare, right? We are looking at data related to behavioral health issues with our community. You wouldn't put on the data that you are going to release information because it would be a privacy issue about specific individuals, but you could graph out potentially, challenges within the behavioral health industry from a community level, not identifying individuals. So making sure, disguising the type of document that it is, that's sometimes a good thing, but distorting information is what we're talking about here, and that's unethical. To move really quickly because we only have a little bit of time left, so I'm not going to go into, distorting information any further, but disability, exceptional populations, those are things that are really important. You should take a look at. It's the end of the chapter, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time there. But don't use certain terms and using certain terms. That's something I think that's really key and pivotal for you to take a look at as well. Okay to use discriminatory language, and that is on page 373. take some time to look at that. As we wrap up, I appreciate all the effort, and I hope you enjoyed this chapter on ethical communication.